And so from my perspective, I look at more at equity, and I look at it from an empirical perspective. So I'm really going out and really trying to measure and assess what's happening. And I look at 3 different areas. So frequently we think about distribution concerns. That's who wins and who loses when you put down a protected area. But the other aspects that are really important that sometimes don't get noticed is, 1, the process. How did that law get created? Who was involved in it? What was the decision-making process? Was it participatory? Was it transparent? And that links very much with recognition. What stakeholders were involved? What knowledge, norms, and values were included in this process? And in the end, which stakeholders are then recognized in the distribution of costs and benefits? So those are the 3 dimensions that I'm looking at when I start to assess conservation policies and programs and see what do they mean from a social or environmental justice perspective. So the 2 studies. So 1, I returned back to Honduras after my master's for my doctoral work because I was still really interested with this whole problem of agricultural expansion and what you could do. And I was fortunate because while Honduras decided that they were going to strengthen their protected area, they were going to bring in more forest guards and they were going to put sort of greater demarcation of the government's control over these lands. On the neighboring, just on the other side of the river, in Nicaragua, indigenous residents were facing similar problems with outsiders moving in. There was also what you call a paper park, a park in name that had been created but really wasn't effective. And what a set of NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, and the government did was rather than establish the protected area, they established indigenous people's territorial rights. And the indigenous people were given then the right to make their own land management plans. So it was a perfect setup for me to see which works better, right? Having a traditional protected area, or what happens when you recognize indigenous people's rights to their land. And in sum, very quickly, what I found is that those where they had recognized indigenous territories, they were better able to control agricultural expansion. Both outsiders moving in, but they also had land use plans for internally controlling their own expansion. And this has since been found in a number of studies in different locations internationally. When you recognize resource users' rights, it's not always, but it's more likely that you're going to have stable management conditions. But for me, what was really interesting was the why, and that's where it was critical. It was the process. So when this started, the non-governmental organizations and the government officials only included the indigenous residents in the process. So they went out and started demarcating their lands, thinking about what the rules would be about how you could use the forest. And the settlers that had recently come there in the last 10 to 15 years got up in arms. And what they did was kidnap the leaders of the indigenous groups, as well as some of the officials. And they said, you know what? We want to be included in the process. And ultimately, they were included in the process, and they negotiated where the boundaries would be, and they negotiated what they would do with settlers that were already inside those boundaries. And when I talked with people about why they no longer kept going into the indigenous lands, they said, it's because we created the law and we signed the law. So it was their participation in that process that in the end has been critical in ensuring compliance and forest conservation in that area. I want to just focus on the other, which is more recent work, which is payment for ecosystem services. And particularly, I'm looking at that in communal lands, so with communities. I don't know how many of you are familiar with payment for ecosystem services. Some, I see not some. But the idea here is basically, once again, it's recognizing people's rights and their dependency on the land. Frequently, if you're thinking here, the example is we've got farmers that are using land for cattle. That's degrading the water system. We want to depend on the water. But rather than putting down the traditional protected area model, which would say, can't have your cows up there anymore, these farmers get paid on the condition that they bring their cows down. And so the idea is that you're compensating folks for the loss of livelihoods because you can no longer use those lands. Payment for ecosystem services is highly controversial for a number of reasons. But where I find it particularly interesting from an equity perspective is when it gets implemented in communities. And that's what's occurred in Ecuador. So think right now if SPU, the city of Seattle contacted SPU and said, you know what, you've got a problem with traffic congestion here and you're polluting, we want to do something about it. If you sign a contract that says none of you will drive to school here, then we will pay you a lump sum and you can decide how to divide that up amongst your students, staff, faculty. Some of you may be like, big deal. I don't drive to campus because I live really close. It doesn't matter to me. Some of you may be thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to get to my job? How am I going to get to, like my kids, I have to drop them off. I live really far away. I can't do that. You want me to take my individual, I can't take my car, I have to take the bus? That's what happens when these gets implemented in communities as well. So in Ecuador, they've implemented this with communities, but just like here, where you are not a homogeneous group with needs, in Ecuador as well, in these communities, not all community members are using lands the same. So when a community signs an agreement and says, we're no longer going to be able to use our lands for agriculture or for cattle, that has different impacts on different community members. And that raises a number of equity concerns. So that's what I've been looking at more recently with a team of researchers. And there's a number of equity questions. How does the community, how would SPU make the decision to participate? Once again, is it inclusive or not? Who has to change their land uses? There's particular concern over whether poor or marginalized folks may be more likely to have to change their land uses than the wealthier. How are benefits distributed across households? This lump sum of money comes twice a year to these communities. Is there a certain elite group that gets it? Are those that had to make changes, are they actually receiving some of the benefits? And then finally, is this distribution of costs and benefits perceived to be fair amongst the community members?